Thank you very much, Adam, for inviting me here and for this generous introduction. I've been following the Center for Psychoanalytic Thought from the distance and across language barriers, and I'm so excited to be able to discuss my work with you here. Let's see if this also works now with sharing my screen. All right. This should work. An orgy of herrings. So first, like the material I'm going to present, as Adam mentioned, is partly a sneak preview, a condensed part of my contribution to this co-written book, which will be published in January 2023 at Leuven University Press, Ferenczi Dialogues on Trauma and Catastrophe. And while I am not a psychoanalyst, my two co-authors are Raluca Soriano in Great Britain and Jakob Starberg in Sweden. And this book is a kind of interdisciplinary exchange on the social, political, cultural, and clinical relevance of the Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi. So my presentation is today, on the one hand, a little sneak preview, but on the other hand, a report from an ongoing work in progress for the monography I'm writing in German on the problem of heredity, Ferenczi, Freud, and the politics of bioanalysis. As a scholar of German literature, I'm particularly interested in Ferenci's exophonic German voice. He lived in Budapest and wrote mostly in German, but the dominating lines of his theoretical and clinical reception today still largely follows the trail of the Hungarian Jewish diaspora, which began soon after his death in 1933. So he's most often discussed on the basis of different translations from German. So there's a vast amount of research on Ferenczi in English language relational psychoanalysis in both North and South America, in France and in Italy. There are studies on Ferenci's influence on Melanie Klein, Michael Balint, Nicolas Abraham and Maria Torok, on Jean Laplanche, and of course on Sigmund Freud. So the collaboration between Ferenczi and Freud peaked during the years of the First World War. During this time, Ferenczi and Freud set out together to rethink the role of catastrophes, both in the life of the individual and in natural history. Ferenczi called this project bioanalysis in his book Thalassa. He defined bioanalysis as an attempt to rewrite biology, to rewrite the history of evolution and phylogenesis from a psychoanalytic perspective. My presentation today will focus on this pursuit, what it means and why it may be relevant. In a way, I am removing Ferenczi from inner psychoanalytic debates and trying to reconstruct his position in the conflict of scientific and political debates over heredity and evolutionary thought in the early 20th century. Michel Foucault once wrote that it is the political honor of psychoanalysis, beginning with Freud's break with neuropsychiatry in the 1880s, to have formed a counter model to the idea of hereditary degeneration. If we agree with this, how does then the biological speculation in psychoanalysis, the phylogenetic fantasies of Ferenczi and Freud, relate to this? Some of you may be acquainted with Frank Soloway's Freud, Biologist of the Mind, which remains an invaluable study of the sources of these phylogenetic speculation of Freud and Ferenci's engagement with 19th century biology. However, while Soloway arrived at the conclusion that Freud and Ferenczi were biologists of the mind, that is to say, under the influence of an outdated natural scientific theory, I believe it is productive to radically change the perspective. Because restricting ourselves to the question of how these early psychoanalysts stood under the influence of 19th century biology leads to an impasse where only two different conclusions seem possible. To either miss the point by joining Soloway in declaring Freud and Ferenczi biologists of the mind, or to miss the point by defensively replying that this may be true for the phylogenetic parallel, but everybody makes mistakes, and the true relevance of psychoanalytic theory lies elsewhere, far from these embarrassing aberrations of biological speculation. And for me, the fact that everything related to the phylogenetic parallel has become somewhat of a source of embarrassment for later psychoanalytic theory makes the subject all the more interesting. So my suggestion is that Ferenczi's biological speculation is not an exception from, but a crucial part of what Foucault described as a psychoanalytic counter-model. My focus lies on the contrasts between Ferenczi's writing and his sources from 19th century biology. And I have arrived at the conclusion that we should read the phylogenetic parallel in Ferenczi and in Freud as a way of working through a politically charged natural scientific heritage, the Darwinisms of the 19th century, as viewed in the face of the impending catastrophes of the 20th century. So I am reading the biological speculation in Ferenczi and Freud as a perhaps failed, but yet as an attempt to intervene with political and scientific debates at a time when eugenics and racial theories came to dominate the medical sciences. So my presentation is divided into 6 brief parts. Freud's theory of sexuality meets popular Darwinism in a soldier's library. And then we go into this library and read Wilhelm Bölsche's Herrings and Ferenczi's Thalassa. Then there is a little detour, Weltanschauung, fetishistic disavowal in popular Darwinism. And then we go back to Thalassa, neurotic evolution. Then comes the final real chapter on heroic organs and hysteric organs, the organology of Sándor Ferenczi. And then I will end with some final remarks. But first, Freud's theory of sexuality meets popular Darwinism in a soldier's library. In a letter to Freud in the spring of 1915, Sándor Ferenczi mentions witnessing young soldiers celebrating the eve of departure to the front. Things were very jolly, no trace of the fear of death. Everybody sang and danced. Everybody volunteered to go. And such were the scenes during the beginning of the First World War, during the final phase of the long 19th century, which came to its end in the horrors of attrition warfare. Since the autumn of 1914, Ferenczi served as a chief medical officer to a squadron of hussars, armed cavalry, in the small garrison town of Pápa in Transdanubia. During the beginning of the war, he still had time at his hands, learned how to ride a horse, and spent his leisure hours translating Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality to Hungarian. So imagine Ferenczi as an officer in uniform, surrounded by soldiers, and immersed in the groundbreaking 3 essays in which Freud blended his clinical view on neurosis with metapsychology and blurred the line between sound sexuality and perversion. Essays in which hysteria, for a short period of time, almost came to serve Freud as an anthropological paradigm. Apart from being his translator, Ferenczi was Freud's friend, follower, and his patient. While striving to continue his analysis with the grounding father himself via letters and sporadic visits, Ferenczi ended up drafting this little book, which was to be published 10 years later as Versuch einer Genitaltheorie, the attempt of a theory of genitality. In most languages, the book is known under the title Thalassa, named after the sea and an assumed regressive trend or gravity. Ferenczi's bold hypothesis that all land-living creatures unknowingly long for earlier life forms underwater. Thalassa has been termed the silent partner of Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle. It has further been characterized as a masterpiece of ambivalence in relation to Freud, a cumbersome piece of theory where Ferenczi's submission goes hand in hand with the beginning of a rebellious approach. According to Carlo Bonomi, Ferenczi's theory of genitality is a mockery of Freud's theory of sexuality, exaggerated up until absurdity and deconstructed from within. To put it bluntly, Ferenczi ends up theorizing not only genitality, but the genitals themselves, with the morphology of human reproductive organs as a point of departure. He performs a staggering act of speculation through time and space. Interpreting anatomy, he draws the conclusion that the reaction to a set of primordial environmental catastrophes find a displaced expression in our bodies. The Hungarian title of Thalassa is Katasztrófa, and the little book culminates in a table of 2 columns and 5 rows, according to which physiological phenomena at the level of ontogenesis, individual catastrophes, stand in a complex relation to a series of catastrophes in the phylogenetic past. In phylogenesis, we find the origin of life and other such catastrophes, such as the recession of the ocean and the ice age. In the second column, these catastrophes are echoed at the level of ontogenesis, the maturation of germ cells, fertilization, embryal development, birth, and sexual development. In other words, Ferenczi views the physiological side of genitality as the expression, the belated abreaction of not only an ontogenetic, but also a phylogenetic catastrophe. The male genital organ is the prime example for Ferenczi's strange organology. The erect penis unknowingly acts out the agony of a fish thrown up on land. So if there is such a thing, then this image is somewhat of an anticipatory parody of a line of thought in Ferenczi's clinical diary of 1932, where Ferenczi, a dying man, interprets masculinity as the result of a traumatic neurosis. Thalassa also prefigures aspects of the famous paper Confusion of Tongues of 1933, where Ferenczi not only coined the famous notion of an introjection of the aggressor, but also spoke of traumatic progression. What we are used to call progress and development is of traumatic origin. In Thalassa, evolutionary development appears as a kind of traumatic progression in this sense. And as I will explain towards the end of my presentation, Thalassa reframes the erection as a traumatically induced hysterical fit. Indeed, references to Freud's divergent theories of hysteria are crucial for Ferenczi's organology. His speculation is an experimental field for playfully combining Freud's earlier notion of traumatic hysteria and the later theory of an unconscious wish. It is not a coincidence that Ferenczi drafted his catastrophe theory of evolutionary history during the First World War, which was already in the Weimar era interpreted as the first man-made catastrophe. And this leads us back to the garrison town of Pápa. As it turns out, Freud's 3 essays were not the only reading material at Ferenczi's disposal during his time in the Squadron of Hussars. While translating Freud's theory of sexuality, Ferenczi read what the small soldier's library had to offer. It seems to have been filled with the popular bestsellers of 19th century natural history. Looking back in 1923, Ferenczi particularly mentions Ernst Haeckel and Wilhelm Bölsche. And my main thesis is that Ferenczi's theory of genitality, his phylogenetic fantasia, is a psychoanalytic subversion of the popular scientific sources that were formative for the generation that went to war in 1914. Since the 1860s, the German biologist, zoologist, and philosopher Ernst Haeckel combined Darwin with Goethe and promoted a highly influential version of Darwinism, which was not yet, as later in the tradition of August Weismann, seen in any opposition to Lamarckism. He declared his monist worldview with reference to Spinoza, however, proceeding to explain all matters of the soul, of society, and of culture as a direct extension of evolutionary history. In 1863, Haeckel spoke of a natural law of progressive development and a continual process of perfection, which he also applied to society as a consequence of the war of all against all. And this thought is also at the core of his later books. Haeckel's follower, Wilhelm Bölsche, an author, publicist, and promoter of nature conservation, presented a literary account of Haeckelianism, which has been labeled erotic monism. In Das Liebesleben in der Natur, a three-volume work of popular scientific prose published between 1898 and 1903, Bölsche narrates the evolutionary history of man as a succession of pre-human mating acts, scenes of graphically described copulation. Here is the cover of the English language translation, Love Life in Nature. What is at stake here is the contrast between Ferenczi's narrative on the one hand and the ideological implications of the bestsellers quoted by him on the other. Looking back, the tension between Thalassa and the writings of Haeckel and Bölsche sheds a light on the fantasies that accompanied the biopolitical projects of the 20th century. And I'm thinking of the notion of vitality, mastery, and progress in the libidinally charged gray zone between biological discourses and politics. There is a libidinal investment that can be sensed already in Haeckel. It is spelled out overtly in Bölsche's erotic monism, and in Ferenci's Thalassa, it is reinterpreted and connected to trauma. So while I'm removing Ferenczi from the inner psychoanalytic debates, I do believe that this move will lead us back to eminently psychoanalytic questions. Wilhelm Bölsche's Herrings and Ferenci's Thalassa. Anyone who wishes to understand the enthusiastic reception of Charles Darwin in German language culture around 1900 should do what Ferenczi did in the Soldiers' Library in 1914, read Wilhelm Bölsche. Published around the turn of the century, the 3 volumes of Love, Life in Nature sold 80,000 copies in Germany only within less than 3 decades. These books were equally present in literary salons, in workers' libraries, and with the Lebensreform movement. In 1903, a German journal for gynecology promoted Love, Life in Nature as compulsory reading for physicians to be recommended to adolescents from the age of 14. Considering the immense popularity of these books, it seems significant that they have fallen into almost complete oblivion. To compensate for a perhaps symptomatic case of cultural amnesia, I will quote extensively from the first volume of Love, Life in Nature. These are excerpts from the 20 pages long Orgy, written by Bölsche and read by Ferenczi in Pápa. And the small illustrations are from the German edition of Das Liebesleben in der Natur. Do you hear the wind whistle and the waters splash? Norway, the sharp sea air plays with its salty breath and fish smell. It is the silvery glare of a many-headed living thing that presses on closer and closer. The herring draws near, united in million. Der Hering naht zu Millionenvereins. The island of living fish extends 5 miles in length as well as in breadth. Now here, now there, a single body flashes up, as if bluish-white flames played out of the excited, roaring element, as if the island wanted to discharge itself in volcanic convulsions, in vulkanischen Zuckungen entladen. But the colossal mass of fish gets jammed, staut sich. The closeness with which they are pressed and squeezed together suddenly releases the whole restrained voluptuousness of love in a form that, like this mass tempest, has something almost brutal, in any event, something gigantic about it. Thick clouds of male seminal fluid pour through the briny flood. Durch die Salzflut ergießen sich dichte Wolken männlicher Samenflüssigkeit. Clouds that are so tremendous that the ocean becomes turbid far and wide, and the whole silver island of voluptuously agitated fish bathes and swims therein. Wolken so gewaltig, dass der Ozean sich weithin trübt, dass die ganze Silberinsel wollüstig bewegter Fische darin badet, darin schwimmt. A drama without its equal, for a creation extended to a joint mass act, Gesamtakt, whose quivering and wild outpourings make the ocean swell and froth. Each individual conjointly swimming in the vital force of millions, Lebenskraft von Millionen, and giving and taking at the same general source, allgemeinen Quell. And this orgy of herrings is followed by descriptions of copulating dinosaurs, marsupials, and more, each time in vivid graphic detail. We are introduced to the mammoth male afire with love. His glands in the ears begin to perspire, and another important protagonist is the crocodile, introduced here with an organ, quote, swelled up into a stiff cone as if it were in an enraged turkey cock's throat. A wild fellow in the frenzy of love. It hurls its female roughly on her back, and I'll leave it there. Together with Paolo Mantegazza's Fisiologia dell'amore, Bölsche's books belong to the first modern affirmative descriptions of sexual acts that were considered acceptable even in bourgeois bookshelves. In Freud's fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria, the overexcitement of the young girl Dora is associated with her habit to read Mantegazza's Physiology of Love and books of that sort in their house by the lake. With books of that sort, Freud's contemporaries will most certainly have associated Bölsche. The breakthrough of the first volume of Love, Life in Nature, including the Orgy of Herrings, was already a fact when Dora spent her holiday with the K family by the lake. What renders Bölsche's volume so important as a document of their time is the way in which progressive optimism, evolutionary enthusiasm, and sexualization overtly coincide. Bölsche speaks of the rhythmotropism of the universe and of organic life as if the rhythm of copulation were pushing development further forwards and upwards towards purification, technological progress, and victory. This optimism is dialectically linked to a seemingly opposite tendency. In Love, Life in Nature, the copulatory scenes invite the reader to chime in with non-human, so-called lower forms of life. And as it turns out, the herring is not only thought of as our ancestor at the phylogenetic level, the herring also embodies a previous form of life of each and every one of us at the level of ontogenesis. And after an interim of the many thousand years since man first appeared on Earth, a great significant mystery manifests itself in the embryo that is just germinating deep in the mother's womb. The embryo becomes a fish again, before it becomes man, in the dark maternal depths, where there is neither land nor sea. The gill slits appear on the neck of the tiny, delicate bud of the future man, the gill slits by means of which the fish ingeniously separates the vital oxygen from its native element, water. The limbs, too, appear in the rounded form of fins. Once more, the picture of the primordial fish, arises quivering in the haze. The primordial fish, which in the gray twilight of a past age gave life to higher beings, who rose ever higher and higher until last man, like a new superworld, Überwelt, flamed out of their crown. Thus, this wild, grotesque picture is also connected most intimately with you. In your mother's womb, you were a herring too. Bölsche claims to interpolate the inner herring of each and every reader. A rebel against the inhibiting effects of civilization, a defender of liberated sexuality, Bölsche insists that our intimate sexual connection with the herrings can be grasped intuitively. Remember, remember, he murmurs, challenging the anthropocentric account. However, challenging the anthropocentric account in a way that is not compatible with any Deleuzian notion of becoming small, Bölsche's herring is bound for glory. In Love, Life in Nature, the euphoric affirmation of everything that threatens the borders of the subject merges seamlessly with a fantasy of being part of a larger, forceful, natural unity that rises ever higher, higher. So returning to Ferenczi, it is important to bear in mind that Bölsche's progressive optimism from around 1900 must have seemed unbearably naive in retrospect from the point of view of the ongoing war. And yet, by quoting Bölsche affirmatively in Thalassa, Ferenczi readily chimes into Bölsche's regressive fantasy. Ferenczi thinks with Bölsche's images and pushes the phylogenetic fantasy to the extreme. And I will insist that Thalassa nevertheless performs a critical intervention, despite the fact that Ferenci's mode of reception is almost constitutively unsuspicious. Ferenci's criticism is difficult to detect. His style and gesture is not critical. Rather, he owns up to the libidinal forces at work in Bölsche's volumes and acknowledges the enjoyment of this untimely grand narrative. But why? Perhaps it is relevant to know that Ferenczi was notorious for joining his patients even into their psychotic hallucinations in order to work with their images. Another answer may be that he does not deny the lost perverse pleasures and the reasons to mourn. Ferenci's Thalassa is an elegy, not only for the aquatic past of our species, but more importantly, in the face of the First World War, an elegy also for the scattered worldview of progressive optimism. While Bölsche's image of the fish in the womb is crucial for Ferenci's Thalassa, I want to try and demonstrate precisely how Ferenczi plays, almost toys around with Bölsche's phylogenetic fantasy. But first, I want to provide some background on Bölsche and the German language reception of Darwin, so please prepare for a little detour. Weltanschauung, fetishistic disavowal in popular Darwinism. In 1917, Freud famously argued that the universal narcissism of men, their self-love, suffered 3 severe blows, Kränkungen, humiliations, from science. Among them, the biological humiliation associated with the name Charles Darwin. For the first readers of On the Origin of Species, the relation between human and non-human animals suddenly appeared as too close for comfort. In her classic study on Darwin's plots, literary scholar Gillian Beer shows how wounded anthropological narcissism manifested itself as disgust in Victorian culture. She quotes rejections that register a physical shudder, early readers of Darwin fearing misogyny, the frog in the bed, or what Ruskin called the filthy heraldries, which record the relation of humanity to the Ascidian or the crocodile. In striking contrast to the Victorian scenario described by Beer, neither Haeckel nor Bölsche seem to shudder at the thought of our intimate bond with frogs, Ascidians, or crocodiles. Instead, the narrator, in Love, Life in Nature, bursts out in euphoria. Listen with rapt attention to this cooing and croaking of the frog chorus, remember, remember. So how precisely does this celebratory approach relate to the phobic reaction? If the phobic reaction appears as defensive or even reactionary, should then Bölsche's affirmative gesture to embrace the frog, the swamp, and the creatures of the mud as our kin be considered emancipatory, or at least somehow more at ease with man's modest place in nature, as it were? Not necessarily. The idea of a blow from biology goes far beyond the question of our attitude towards unsightly non-human creatures. According to Gillian Beer, the Darwinian blow is above all connected to a narrative crisis, since Darwin, telling the story of organic life as a triumphant history of progress, distracts the attention from extinction, a process of dying that exceeds the capacities of imagination. An epistemological crisis is part of the scenario as well. Darwin emphasized that the course of evolution can only be inferred through retrospective construction, as a brittle genealogy of the present, based on the fact that most of the empirical material has been erased. Only a fraction of all life forms have left fossils behind, and of these fossils, in turn, only a fraction are ever to be found in fragmentary form. This constitutive obscurity turned out to be the most fragile part of Darwin's legacy. Haeckel and Bölsche characterized their work as popular scientific Weltanschauung. Worldview, in this popular tradition, bears the promise of a universal science in touch with intuition, emotion, and sensual experience, knowledge attainable and graspable for the subject. It can be understood as a forceful reaction against the process in which science was increasingly divorced from intuition, rendering nature incomprehensible, less natural, as it were. According to both Freud and Adorno, popular Weltanschauung is characterized by the boundless narcissism of a subject that claims to grasp the entire universe as if the modern diversification of sciences had never taken place. Haeckel presented his evolutionary monism as a manifestation of both progressive and epistemological optimism. While this explains the broad appeal of his popular worldview, it is equally true that a certain defensiveness lies at the core of his entire edifice. His popularity is built upon a libidinal economy that protects itself from a crisis that ought to have been suffered. In other words, the cultural phenomenon of evolutionist enthusiasm, represented by Haeckel and Bölsche, only seemingly provides a reason to question the validity of the Darwinian blow as a paradigm. At closer consideration, the popularity of Haeckelian Darwinism confirms rather than confutes the thesis of a narcissist reaction. The celebratory affirmation presents a particular mode of restorative defense. One might say that this Weltanschauung offers attractive options for fetishistic disavowal. On fetishistic disavowal, From 1924 on, Freud came to use the term disavowal, Verleugnung, for a mode of defense in which the subject fails to acknowledge the reality of a traumatic perception of which castration or the absence of a penis in a girl is seen as a prototype. Fetishism in the psychoanalytic sense is linked to a loss or a lack that is simultaneously acknowledged and disavowed. The satisfaction of the fetish derives from the fact that the fetish represents the horrifying lack while keeping it conveniently out of sight. As a fetishistic evolutionary narrative, Haeckel's Weltanschauung and Bölsche's Love, Life in Nature claim to represent Darwinism while simultaneously covering up the disorientating effects of the blow. Haeckel offered a manageable format. He transformed an essentially disorienting concept into something graphical, clear, and vivid, in German anschaulich, which implies much more than the term overviewable, overseeable, übersichtlich. Ontogenesis is a short and rapid recapitulation of phylogenesis. While Darwin described evolution as a process in which change occurs over unimaginably long periods of time exceeding the realm of subjective perception, Haeckel, by means of acceleration and miniaturization, enables his readers to perceive evolution within the span of an individual life. Haeckel's notorious chart of embryos in Anthropogenie is an example of this effect. It shows 8 creatures in 3 stages of their embryonal development, their ontogenesis. On the left page, a fish, an amphibian, a reptile, and a bird. And on the right page, 4 mammals, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. In order to observe these 8 different creatures separately, one would have to read Haeckel's chart vertically, in columns, because only when moving from up to down, each of the columns show the ontogenetic development of one particular creature underwater, in the egg, and in utero. Our Occidental reading habits, however, make it more likely for us to proceed horizontally, in rows from the left to the right, producing a little flip chart before our inner eye. The lowest row, then, already implies what is spelled out explicitly by Bölsche, that every pregnant woman literally bears a fish inside her, that we were all some kind of herrings in ontogeny as well. The womb becomes the site of a metamorphosis that bypasses death. Haeckel configures the mythically charged circular structure of recapitulation as an element of an upward movement until, according to Bölsche, at last man, like a new superworld, flames out. The catchword of Haeckelian evolutionary monism is Alleinheit, and both Haeckel and Bölsche argued that the romantic unity of nature had been scientifically proven by Darwin. The libidinal appeal of this concept is related to what Freud calls the oceanic feeling. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud links both religion and the transgressive fantasy of coalescence to infantile megalomania. What may appear modest, the distinct feeling of closeness to nature and to matter, reverts to omnipotence when the subject claims to grasp the entire universe. And this leads us to the malign side of Bölsche, a dimension which has no counterpart in Ferenczi. Like Haeckel, Bölsche derives his notion of the social directly from biology. The social ideal, how it comes down to the gruesomely bright reality of our time, heaving, sweating, bleeding, damped, bloated, orbed. This too is, in last analysis, but a question of love. It is latent in the fish that sexual love sifts out of the ocean until, like a silvery isle, they rise in a mass from the water, a community of birth-giving sexual creatures for whom the narrow, shallow fjord is one large bridal bed. There is a notion of power, Kraft, at play here, for which it is essential to conceive of oneself as part of an animalistic herd. Bölsche's image of the shoal and the swarm passes smoothly via the herd into the image of the human crowd. Bölsche swims with the current of late 19th century mass psychology, which derived human group behavior directly from the herd instinct of animals. But while the founder of mass psychology, Gustave Le Bon, another reader of Haeckel, by the way, displays a phobic attitude towards the crowds, For Le Bon, a conservative, the crowd is associated with the looming danger of revolution and of a biosocial degradation. Bölsche, quite in contrast, affirms the forces of the herd. But the point is that this doesn't make Bölsche emancipatory. Bölsche's love life in nature sets off deep in the ocean, but the vision is directed upwards towards the sky. In the fish orgy, the euphoric affirmation of everything that threatens the borders of the subject merges seamlessly with the fantasy of being part of a larger, forceful unity. Only as through a crack in the sky, this in den Wolken, can you see this today. For the new world view, Weltanschauung, is still forming itself, clenching, condensing, and casting rings of its own like a star in the making. Who can guess what will one day circle around it and who will become the sun, wer ihre Sonne werden wird? Who will become the sun of the crowd? In Love Life in Nature, Bölsche still has the development of humanity as a whole in mind. 3 decades later, he will speak of Germans only. In 1934, Bölsche fills the crack in the clouds, the space left open in Love Life in Nature, with Adolf Hitler, who appears unnamed as the greatest in a lineup of German geniuses. More powerfully than anywhere else, these persons go straight up through our German history, where the great person sinks, the people appear to sink, where he suddenly appears between us. It is always as if the mists were torn again. And then he talks of Goethe and lots of other, Frederick II, and then he arrives at, I need not to mention the name of which we are all thinking at the moment, and before which even the fiercest opponents must admit this miracle of personality, and this published in 1934 to addressing the new German of the time. So, yeah. The escalatory line I have drawn here from a libidinally charged description of a shoal of herrings to the crowd awaiting Hitler is in itself catastrophic, perhaps even hysteric. Were the readers who enjoyed the fish orgy already preparing themselves for participation in the Nazi crowds? It would probably be wise to take a few steps back and just dwell at the fact that Bölsche blurs several categories of our social psychological sensorium. Around 1900, Bölsche considered himself a socialist. His intellectual artistic circles in Friedrichshagen near Berlin were even mocked as a Bolshevist paradise. Bölsche served as a source of inspiration for progressive sexology, and his descriptions doubtlessly destabilized the body image prevalent in the Wilhelmine era. For instance, when he confronts his readers with the evolutionary origin of the penis, quote, the simple guttered plug at the crocodile's anus is really the genuine original form of your own member. It is, however, equally true that his narrative is linked to a eugenic fantasy. The idea of an intimate connectedness with non-human animals promises participation in natural potency. In Love Life in Nature, the narrator suggests that our connection to the pre-human ancestors can be reactivated for further empowerment and growth against the looming threat of degeneration. Bölsche's celebration of procreation exposes the libidinous undertones of entire discourses, evolution, heredity, growth, and by extension, the realm of cultural progress. Love Life in Nature stages the overcoming of inhibition, a pathos directed against the repressive side of civilization. While the Wilhelmine society was obviously repressive, the case of Bölsche demonstrates the limited usefulness of what Foucault called the repressive hypothesis as a theoretical tool. The case of Bölsche also reminds us that the appreciation of floods, swamps, and the dynamic capacities of matter, as celebrated in contemporary new materialist approaches, is not in and of itself counter-hegemonic. Bölsche positions himself on the side of what Donna Haraway calls the critters, but that does by far not make him immune to the seductions of fascism. Awaiting a future of healthy, strong men, the liberated humans in the 3rd volume of Love Life in Nature follow the ideals of Lebensreform. They eat raw vegetables, Rohkost, and they exercise naked in the sun, Nacktturnen, to steel themselves and to overcome the weakness of the cultured. Bölsche explicitly proposes to help natural selection on the way, zum Heil immer gesünderer, kräftigerer, glücklicherer Generationen. In 1905, both he and Haeckel were honorary members of the German Association for Racial Hygiene. So to summarize this long detour, if we read Bölsche's Love Life in Nature as a fetishistic evolutionary narrative, both scientific complexity and vulnerability are the wounding aspects at stake, and the fetish is linked to potency, both in terms of capability and of virility. And the fear of degeneration forms the underbelly of this complex. So we arrive at Thalassa, neurotic evolution. Precisely because eugenic thought is typical for a much broader tendency at the time, and by no means limited to right-wing approaches, it is striking that Thalassa, despite diving into Bölsche's marine world, moves against currents. In an epoch marked by the fear of degeneration, psychoanalysis entertains a sympathetic relation to neurotics and hysterics. Freudo-Ferencian bioanalysis takes this tendency even further. As an eccentric experimental field of psychoanalytic theory, bioanalysis inserts the dynamics of neurosis and hysteria into the evolutionary narrative. First of all, bioanalysis, as suggested by Ferenczi, is strictly speaking an attempt to reverse what may be called biologism. While the derogatory term biologism refers to the application of biological standards and terms to psychology and society, Thalassa does the opposite. Ferenczi does not apply biology to psychoanalysis, rather, he applies psychoanalytic terms to biology. So if Thalassa is grandiose, and Thalassa is grandiose, it is because Ferenczi actually claims the interpretational sovereignty of psychoanalysis over natural sciences. In Thalassa, psychoanalytic notions are the models, the Vorbilder at stake. I believe that as prototypes, Vorbilder, of bioanalytic mechanisms, the structure of the neurosis and psychosis with which we are best acquainted will always serve. And in Freud too, the structure of neurosis figures as a model, as a prototype, ein Vorbild, within an evolutionary counter-narrative. The processes involved in the formation of a neurotic phobia, which is nothing else than an attempt to flight from the satisfaction of an instinct, presents us with a model, Vorbild, of the manner of origin of this supposititious instinct towards perfection. What looks as an instinct towards perfection must be read as a neurotic reaction, or according to the model of neurotic reaction. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, inspired by Ferenczi, a disturbance from the outside sets in motion a dynamic which is bound to give a deceptive appearance of being forces tending towards change and progress, writes Freud. The burdensome life path of Freud's primitive organism consists of ever more complicated detours, and if we read closely, these detours result from the effort to avoid any kind of effort. Freud's theoretical fiction of a living organism in its most simplified possible form portrays a creature that would, to quote Bartleby, prefer not to. And in the same spirit, Ferenczi forces his readers to envision creatures that would have preferred not to conquer land. But how then are we supposed to account for the indisputable fact that land-living creatures exist? As if by any means challenging the familiar idea of an innate progressive striving, Ferenczi draws upon the psychoanalytic notion of a neurosis as a flight from a pleasure that has become disagreeable. According to Thalassa, the regressive tendency manifests itself as a reaction formation. He explains that the same force which impels to regression operates when it is prevented therefrom by a censorship in a progressive sense, in the sense, that is, of adaptation and constructiveness. Ferenci's epistemology does not render any original purity accessible. This is a unique trait compared to several psychosomatic theories at his time. If you look at Georg Grodek, Felix Deutsch, Franz Alexander, who followed the goal of purifying the organs from their psychic catexis. In Ferenczi, the organ is structurally neurotic from the start. And furthermore, there is no neutral, transparent language that can represent the organic. Quite differently from Haeckel's morphology, Ferencian organs do not come clear, but demand interpretation. The consequence is the primacy of language within the methodological approach, acknowledging a gap, a remainder within any form of scientific representation. Ferenci's bulkiest gift to biology is the psychoanalytic notion of overdetermination. It seems that we must familiarize ourselves with the idea of the overdetermination of one and the same process, as psychoanalysis teaches us in the case of psychical processes, as well as in its explanation of physiological processes. These lines break with the dream of a transparent language of what is today called the hard sciences. Thalassa applies the notion of overdetermination to organs, tissues, and their elements. Ferenci's pattern of interpretation and construction, and this goes for psychoanalytic methods in general, runs counter to the paradigm of Anschaulichkeit. It is profoundly theoretical and counterintuitive. In bioanalysis, the hypothesis of an originary neurosis replaces the notion of an innate progressive striving. But at this point, one may wonder why bother to replace one biological fantasy, the idea of a tendency towards completion, by another, just more complicated fantasy, the idea of neurotic evolution. What the bioanalytical narrative achieves is firstly a deconstruction of progress and of development. Secondly, it destabilizes the relation between pathology and normalcy. And thirdly, more specifically, Ferenczi brings into the center precisely that which was understood as a threat to development per se, neurosis and hysteria. In Ferenci's narrative, these features neither lead to a lineage towards extinction, nor do they demand eugenically motivated biopolitical intervention. They belong to the structure of organic life itself, life as a post-catastrophic survival. In order to appreciate this intervention, it is crucial to acknowledge the preoccupation with alienation, degeneracy, and neurasthenia in the early 20th century, and how anti-Semitism became established within medical discourse. In psychiatry, there was a consensus that Jews were particularly prone to neurotic diseases. Sándor has demonstrated how psychiatric discourse linked the clinical image of the male hysteric with Judaism. This was partly attributed to the diasporic living conditions and partly to a supposed hereditary susceptibility to all pathogenic effects of modernity. Without ever reflecting this explicitly, bioanalysis declares precisely that which the anti-Semitic norm delegated to Jewish bodies to be the structural law of organic life itself. On a lighter note, Ferenci's complicated fantasy of neurotic evolution brings comic relief. In a letter to Freud, Ferenczi wrote that the idea for Thalassa had come to him at first as a bad joke, continuing, "But I forced myself to take it seriously, though I am ready for the whole thing to turn out to be nonsense." And nonsense or not, a certain gain lies in estranging the common perception and conceptualization of organic life. This defamiliarizing effect brings tension into Haeckel's famous exclamation that we, since Darwin, are all one family with the animal kingdom. While carefully avoiding the notion of a vitalist striving for perfection, Ferenczi interprets the development of reproductive organs as the result of a reaction formation against a striving in the opposite direction. Development occurs as the neurotic reaction to a regressive trend, which in turn was traumatically induced. And this is where the theory of conversion, of hysteria, comes into the picture, applied above all to the male genital organ, the grand hysteric. And I'm now arriving at the last part. Heroic organs, hysteric organs. By the beginning of the First World War, Haeckel's biology was already deemed scientifically outdated, together with the Lamarckism he represented. The legacy of Lamarck is of particular relevance here. On the one hand, Ferenczi and Freud refer affirmatively to Lamarck. His theory offers the opportunity to consider the living soma of the individual, to consider environmental factors and the transgenerational transfer of acquired characteristics. Freud's stubborn sympathy for Lamarck has been explained by the fact that Lamarckism, within several socially progressive movements, was linked to the hope of biological upgrading of disadvantaged minorities, such as the Jewish population. Neo-Lamarckist eugenics was coupled with public health reforms and efforts for improving environmental conditions as a means to reverse supposed hereditary effects of the ghettoization of earlier generations. In bioanalysis, and I've tried to read it really closely, I don't see this. It is, there is no such logic of biopolitical optimization in Freud and Ferenczi's use of Lamarckism. Their strategy is of a different kind. Pertaining to notions of development and heredity, Ferenczi actually breaks with Lamarck, although he refers to Lamarck affirmatively. While Lamarck emphasizes the inheritance of positive features, gains, and capacities, Ferenczi prefigures the reconceptualization of tradition in Freud's Moses and monotheism, where a series of repressed, violent, and unverifiable events are conceived of as more influential than what was willingly recorded and consciously passed on to future generations. This becomes obvious in the following formulation from Thalassa. What we call heredity is perhaps therefore only the displacing upon posterity of the bulk of traumatically unpleasurable experiences in question. So heredity in bioanalysis is not an achievement of, not a transmission of achievements and abilities, but rather a transgenerational transfer of something burdensome and unknown across generations of latency. The different notions of heredity are linked to different organologies. It has been convincingly argued that the erection serves Lamarck as a paradigm for development in general. According to Lamarck, organs develop because fluids flow into the activated body part when stimulated and used. This curbs development, strengthening, and growth. Quite in contrast, the Ferencian organ must be thought of as ridden by ancestral coping mechanisms that defy the categories of pathology and normalcy and have nothing to do with vitalism. Ferenczi turns the relation between erection and hysteria on its head. He uses hysteria as a paradigm for reinterpreting the erection. This leads us back to Freud's case of Dora, where Freud famously stated that the subject of erection solves some of the most interesting hysterical symptoms. Freud is, of course, referring to women's reaction when confronted with the outlines of men's genitals as seen through their clothing. Ferenczi seems to have read this sentence against the grain by taking it literally. In Thalassa, the male genital is structurally hysteric. The physiology of erection, coitus, and ejaculation appear as symptoms in a hysteric fit. Ferenczi interprets organs in general, and the penis in particular, following the pattern by which Freud explained the nervous cough of his famous patient, Dora. Freud's interpretation of Dora's nervous cough is, among other things, a demonstration of overdetermination. Freud underlines that it is necessary for the various meanings of a symptom. It is not necessary for the various meanings of a symptom to be compatible with one another. Dora's cough signifies at least 6 different things. It is an imitation of her father's illness, of her relation to Mr. K, of the regret at his absence, of her wish to make him a better wife, of sexual intercourse with her impotent father, of identification with her father's lover, Mrs. K, not to speak of her homosexual desire towards her. And Freud assures us that this series is by no means complete. The symptom resembles an old hose, alter Schlauch, into which new wine is poured. In Thalassa, the penis is this alter Schlauch. In coitus, the penis acts out a compromise between the anal desire to retain and the urethral desire to give out, while the frictional movements express the wish for a kind of self-castration to tear away the itching part of the body. The penis is, in general, a symbol of the more primitive boring implement, the tooth. It also plays the role of an executive manager, and procurist, like a protagonist in a Kafka novel, who provides for the discharge of sexual tension, Lustabfuhrgeschäft, on behalf of the organism. The penis is also a miniature of the total ego, and it signifies the fish set down on land. It enacts the struggles of that great primal creature among its ancestors, which suffered the great catastrophe of the drying up of the sea. Ferenczi affirmatively quotes Bölsche, who emphasizes that the male member has a past as well. It is a Milocenian member. With it, man turns off at the fish from which he came in purple days. But Ferenczi, while quoting this, refrains from quoting what follows in Bölsche, the main argument in Love, Life in Nature, according to which the non-human origin of the male member contains a prefiguration of development and growth. This is what Bölsche concludes and what Ferenczi tellingly ignores. But there is more to it. In it, the first penis in evolutionary history, lies the entire upward road of evolution to man, the crown of all. Every step forward once gleamed here like a doubtful little flame. Will the wind suddenly blow it out or fan it into bright flame? All humanity's geniuses once slumbered here, ready for resurrection. Final remarks. Freud's theory of sexuality meets popular Darwinism in a soldier's library, imagining what Ferenczi's writing desk may have looked like during the months in Pápa. It appears as if the contradictions of his time were condensed in this scene of reading and writing, in this strangest of settings, in this constellation of books. Ferenczi's genital theory subverts its sources by means of an organology informed by different paradigms of hysteria. On the one hand, this is an example of what Ilse Grubrich-Simitis has shown, namely that Freud and Ferenczi's phylogenetic speculation served as an experimental field in which they could playfully pursue a series of unanswered questions: how to connect the trauma model of Freud's early seduction theory with the theory of the unconscious wish. On the other hand, apart from inner psychoanalytic debates, the hysteric organology sets Ferenczi apart from the biopolitical fantasies that were formative for the generation that went into war in 1914. These tendencies were prevalent all over the political spectrum at the time and across the division between adepts of Weizmann and Lamarck. Around the outbreak of the First World War, Haeckel supported Germany for eugenic reasons. While Ferenczi was translating Freud's 3 essays, Haeckel claimed to explain the Great War, quote, according to the laws of natural development. While Ferenczi was drafting Thalassa, Haeckel drew a clear line from unicellular protests to the necessity of a German victory in the interest of the human species. While Ferenczi reflected the macabre scenes of joyous departure to the front, Bölsche had already published his essay collection Stirb und Werde, with a proud phoenix on the front cover, rising from the flames and ashes in a ray of light. There is a libidinal investment that can be sensed already in Haeckel. It is spelled out overtly in Bölsche's erotic monism, and it is reinterpreted and connected to trauma in Ferenczi's Thalassa. That doesn't make it less sexual. Rather, it locates sexuality within the context of post-traumatic survival. While Bölsche's rhythmotropism pumps forward like a steam engine, Ferencian bioanalysis reaches for the emergency brake. It is an interruption, a Verfremdungseffekt. It brings in a distancing moment, perhaps even comic relief. Acknowledging this brings us back on another track, to readings of sexuality, history, and trauma that take both the linguistic and the social realm into account. Thank you so much for your attention.